My name is Enid Johnson, and at 68 years old, I never imagined I would be uninvited from my only son Jacob's wedding. The family cabin on Lake Winnipesaukee that I purchased 45 years ago has been our sanctuary through the darkest days after my husband Robert died. But when Jacob met Amanda, everything changed. She decided I wasn't suitable for their upscale Newport wedding. Before I tell you how I turned their perfect wedding plans upside down, let me know where you're watching from and subscribe if you want more stories about standing up for yourself when family tries to push you aside. Life in coastal Maine has always suited me. For 40 years, I taught English at Oceanside High School, finding purpose in opening young minds to literature and writing. I met Robert during my sophomore year at the University of Maine. He was studying engineering, and I was drawn to his thoughtful nature and ambitious dreams. We married right after graduation in 1975, settling into a modest starter home not far from the Atlantic coast. Those early years were filled with financial struggles. Robert worked for a small engineering firm while I began my teaching career. We pinched pennies, clipped coupons, and dreamed about having children and a vacation home someday. Our budget was tight, but we were happy. In 1978, something unexpected happened. My grandmother Eloise passed away and left me an inheritance of $20,000. It wasn't a fortune, but back then it was enough to make a difference. Robert and I had been eyeing a small rundown cabin on Lake Winnipesaukee for months. With my inheritance, we could finally afford it. The truth, which nobody knew until recently, was that I purchased the cabin entirely with my inheritance, and in my name alone. Robert had recently experienced a setback at work with his company going through layoffs and financial troubles. We worried about potential creditors, so my lawyer suggested putting the property solely in my name for protection, though Robert's name appeared on some paperwork for appearance's sake. It was a different time then, when women weren't taken as seriously in financial matters. That little cabin needed everything. The roof leaked, the plumbing was questionable, and the porch sagged dangerously on one side. But it was ours. Every weekend for 2 years, Robert and I drove the 3 hours from Maine to New Hampshire to work on it. He taught himself carpentry from library books, and I learned to sand floors and paint walls. We saved money by doing most of the work ourselves, turning that dilapidated structure into a cozy retreat. In 1981, our son Jacob was born. He was our miracle baby after years of trying to conceive. The doctors had told us it might never happen, which made his arrival even more precious. From the time he was 6 weeks old, Jacob came with us to the cabin. His portable crib fit perfectly in the small second bedroom that would become his space for the next 20-plus years. When Jacob was 7, our world shattered. Robert complained of indigestion one evening after dinner. Within hours, he was gone, a massive heart attack taking him at just 39. I found myself a widow at 36, with a young son to raise and a mortgage to pay. The cabin became our sanctuary during that painful time. I would sit on the dock while Jacob splashed in the shallow water, finding moments of peace amid overwhelming grief. I made Robert a promise as we scattered some of his ashes in the lake. I swore the cabin would remain in our family for generations, a lasting legacy of the love we shared. Raising Jacob alone meant making sacrifices. I took on weekend tutoring jobs to supplement my teacher's salary. Retirement savings took a back seat to Jacob's college fund. We lived frugally, but I made sure Jacob never felt deprived. The cabin became our special place, where school pressures and financial worries seemed far away. Jacob was always a bright, sensitive boy. He inherited his father's analytical mind and my love of stories. Summer days at the cabin were filled with fishing off the dock, where I taught him to bait hooks and release the smaller fish. Robert had started that tradition, and continuing it helped keep his memory alive for both of us. Our holiday traditions centered around the cabin, too. Every Thanksgiving, we invited my sister Laura and her family to join us. The kitchen barely accommodated us all, but somehow those cramped quarters made the celebration more intimate. At Christmas, we hung lights along the porch railing and placed a small tree in the front window visible from the frozen lake. As Jacob grew older, he developed his own relationship with the cabin. In his teen years, he started taking on maintenance projects, proudly showing me the deck he restained or the cabinet door he fixed. It became a place where he could connect with the father he barely remembered through the work of his hands. When Jacob left for Boston University on a partial scholarship, I felt both pride and loss. The cabin seemed emptier without his presence, but he came home for most holidays and parts of summer break. I noticed he brought college friends, occasionally proudly showing off the place where he grew up. His choice to major in finance surprised me a little. I had thought he might pursue engineering like his father, but he explained that understanding money would ensure he never faced the financial insecurity we had experienced after Robert died. I respected his practical approach, even as I sometimes worried about the values of the business world influencing him. After graduation, Jacob secured a position at a financial consulting firm in Boston. His visits home became less frequent as his career demands increased. Still, we managed a week together at the cabin, each summer slipping easily back into our routines of morning coffee on the porch and evening board games by the fireplace. The last truly happy summer at the cabin happened 3 years ago before Jacob met Amanda. He had just received a promotion and took 2 full weeks off. We painted the kitchen cabinets, replaced some worn floorboards, and spent lazy afternoons reading on the dock. One evening, as fireflies appeared over the lake, Jacob told me he was thinking of bringing someone special to the cabin soon. I was delighted at the prospect of him sharing our special place with someone he cared about. Little did I know that the woman he would bring would see our beloved cabin, not as the treasure it was, but as an outdated relic standing in the way of her grand plans for my son and his future. Jacob met Amanda Prescott at a charity gala in Boston 2 years ago. His financial firm had purchased a table, and Amanda was there representing her family's real estate development company. According to Jacob, they connected immediately over champagne and shared business interests. When he first mentioned her, his voice changed, taking on an excited tone I hadn't heard before. Amanda came from significant wealth. Her parents, Richard and Diane Prescott, owned one of the largest luxury real estate development companies in Connecticut. They specialized in waterfront properties and exclusive country club communities. Amanda had grown up with vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard and Aspen, private school education, and a trust fund that ensured she would never worry about money. Their relationship moved quickly. Within 3 months, Jacob was spending most weekends with Amanda in her downtown Boston condo or at her parents' estate in Greenwich. By 6 months, they were engaged. Jacob called me on a Sunday evening to share the news, sounding both excited and strangely nervous. He promised to bring Amanda to Maine soon so we could meet properly. That first meeting happened at Ocean, an upscale restaurant in Portland that I had never visited. Jacob insisted on paying, waving away my protests that the prices were ridiculous for what amounted to tiny portions on enormous plates. I wore my best outfit, a navy blue dress I had purchased for a colleague's retirement party. But the moment I saw Amanda approaching in designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, I felt woefully underdressed. Amanda was undeniably beautiful, with perfectly highlighted blonde hair, manicured nails, and the kind of polished appearance that comes from regular professional attention. She greeted me with an air kiss and a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. Throughout dinner, Amanda made subtle comments that left me feeling diminished. She referred to my teaching career as quaint and asked if I had ever considered moving somewhere more exciting than my small coastal town. When I mentioned the cabin, her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Have you thought about selling it? Lakefront property is extremely valuable these days," she said, as if she were offering helpful financial advice rather than suggesting I part with our family sanctuary. 2 weeks later, Jacob brought Amanda to the cabin for the weekend. I had spent days preparing, cleaning every corner, stocking the refrigerator with gourmet items from the specialty market 30 miles away, and putting fresh flowers in every room. I wanted so badly for her to love the place that meant everything to us. From the moment they arrived, it was clear Amanda was unimpressed. She wheeled her designer luggage across the gravel driveway with a grimace, pausing to take a call on her smartphone before even greeting me. Inside, she glanced around with barely concealed disgust, asking Jacob in a stage whisper if there was cellular service or Wi-Fi. Throughout the weekend, Amanda remained glued to her phone, excusing herself from fishing or board games to handle what she called urgent work matters. During meals, she picked at the food I had carefully prepared, making comments about her dietary restrictions that she hadn't bothered to mention beforehand. Jacob seemed oblivious to her behavior, or perhaps he was choosing to ignore it. I noticed other changes in him during that visit. He was wearing an expensive watch I had never seen before, and he mentioned country club memberships and exclusive restaurants with a familiarity that felt foreign to the son I had raised. The holidays that year brought more changes. Jacob called to say they would be staying at a hotel in Portland rather than at the cabin for Christmas. Amanda had booked them a suite at the city's most expensive hotel as a gift. I drove through a snowstorm to meet them for dinner, only to sit through another meal where Amanda dominated the conversation with stories about her family's holiday traditions in Aspen and plans for their upcoming engagement party. After that, the calls from Jacob became less frequent and more rushed. When we did speak, he seemed distracted, often mentioning meetings with Amanda's father's business associates or social events with her friends. The few times I suggested a weekend at the cabin, he had ready excuses about prior commitments. When they did visit again in the spring, Amanda spent the entire time talking about upgrading their lifestyle once they were married. She had her eye on a waterfront condo in Boston's Seaport District and was already discussing renovation plans with a designer friend. Jacob nodded along, occasionally glancing at me as if gauging my reaction. I tried to connect with Amanda, sharing family recipes and stories about Jacob's childhood. She listened with polite disinterest, changing the subject back to their future plans at every opportunity. When I brought out a photo album of Jacob growing up at the cabin, Amanda accidentally knocked it to the floor, breaking the frame of my favorite picture of Jacob and Robert fishing together. Her apology seemed perfunctory at best. Most concerning was how Jacob had begun to distance himself from our shared memories. When I reminisced about our traditions, he would smile uncomfortably or gently redirect the conversation. It was as if he was embarrassed by his simpler upbringing in Amanda's presence. The cabin, once his favorite place now, seemed to make him uncomfortable. I caught him eyeing the worn furniture and dated kitchen with something like shame. When Amanda made a comment about the cabin being so rustic, Jacob quickly agreed that it could use some significant updating. I never criticized Amanda directly to Jacob. I could see how much he wanted my approval, and I tried to focus on his happiness rather than my concerns. But privately, I worried about the influence she was having on him and the values I thought I had instilled. One particularly telling incident occurred when Amanda found a box of Jacob's childhood mementos in his bedroom closet. Among the items was a handmade fishing lure that Robert had helped him create before he died. Amanda held it up with 2 fingers, as if it were something distasteful. "Why do you keep this junk?" she asked, dropping it back into the box carelessly. Before I could respond, Jacob quickly put the box away, making a joke about his sentimental mother saving everything. The look of dismissal they shared in that moment broke my heart more than any direct insult could have. By the time they left that weekend, I felt like a stranger in my son's life. The Jacob I knew, who valued experiences over possessions and kindness over status, seemed to be fading away, replaced by someone eager to shed his past for Amanda's vision of their future. As they drove away, I stood on the porch, watching until their car disappeared down the lane. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the fear that had been growing inside me, that I might be losing my son to a world where I had no place. The engagement party was held at the Prescott family mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. I drove 5 hours to attend, staying at a budget hotel 30 minutes away, because the nearby accommodations were well beyond my means. The Prescott home was exactly what I had imagined, an imposing colonial on manicured grounds with a view of Long Island Sound. Inside, waitstaff in formal attire circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres, while a string quartet played in the corner. I recognized no one except Jacob, who greeted me with a quick hug before being pulled away by Amanda to meet important guests. I spent most of the evening standing awkwardly near the buffet table, watching my son navigate this unfamiliar world with growing confidence. Diane Prescott, Amanda's mother, made it clear from the beginning that she would be handling all wedding arrangements. At the engagement party, she addressed the gathered guests with a champagne toast, referring to the upcoming nuptials as the social event of the season. When she mentioned the anticipated $200,000 budget, I nearly choked on my drink. That amount was more than my house was worth. Later that evening, I quietly suggested to Jacob that I could host a small gathering at the cabin for close friends and family, either before or after the main event. Amanda overheard and quickly interjected. "We really need to maintain a consistent aesthetic for all wedding-related events," she said with a tight smile. "The cabin just does not fit with our vision." Jacob looked uncomfortable but remained silent. It was becoming a pattern. Whenever Amanda and I disagreed, he would avoid taking sides, which effectively meant supporting her position. The wedding venue was selected without my input, an exclusive estate in Newport, Rhode Island, with a private beach and ballroom. When I asked about the guest list, Amanda explained that the venue had limited capacity, necessitating careful selection of who could attend. She emphasized how her parents had extensive business and social connections that needed to be accommodated. When bridal preparations began, I expected to be included in dress shopping. Instead, Jacob called to ask if I could contribute $2,000 toward Amanda's $15,000 designer gown. I agreed, stretching my budget considerably, only to discover later through social media photos that Amanda, her mother, and 6 bridesmaids had gone shopping without inviting me. Even more hurtful was Jacob's suggestion that I might consider selling some of my mother's jewelry to help with additional wedding expenses. The pieces were family heirlooms I had planned to give to Jacob's future wife as a wedding gift, but it seemed Amanda preferred cash to sentimental items with no designer pedigree. As planning progressed, I noticed I wasn't included in the save-the-date photo session. When the elegant cards arrived in the mail, they featured Amanda's family prominently alongside Jacob, with no mention or image of the mother of the groom. When I called Jacob about the oversight, he explained that they had gone with a certain aesthetic that the photographer had recommended. The bridal shower was another painful exclusion. I waited for an invitation that never came. When I finally inquired, Amanda texted that it must have gotten lost in the mail, but it was too late to include me now as all arrangements were finalized. Through a mutual friend, I saw photos of the lavish event at a country club complete with expensive party favors and a champagne fountain. During a weekend visit to the cabin, I overheard a concerning conversation between Jacob and Amanda on the porch. I had gone to the kitchen to refill their drinks when Amanda's voice carried through the open window. "You know, this place is actually sitting on prime real estate," she was saying. "If we sold it, we could easily put a down payment on that house in Beacon Hill we looked at." Jacob's response was hesitant. "I do not know Mandy. Mom loves this place, and it has been in our family since before I was born." Amanda's laugh was dismissive. "But it is just sitting here most of the year, and the maintenance costs must be a burden for her. We would be doing her a favor, really. Plus, once we are married, you will inherit it eventually anyway, right?" Their voices dropped, and I stood frozen in the kitchen, ice melting in the glasses I held. Jacob had never once asked about the cabin's ownership details, assuming like everyone else that it would naturally come to him someday. I had never corrected this assumption, nor had I shared the truth about how it was purchased. Over the following months, Jacob seemed increasingly stressed about finances. During one phone call, he mentioned taking out a personal loan to cover his portion of the wedding expenses. Amanda had insisted on a designer tuxedo rather than a rental, and their honeymoon plans included first-class flights to the Maldives and a 2-week stay in an overwater bungalow. When I suggested some budget-friendly alternatives for certain aspects of the wedding, such as locally sourced flowers or a scaled-back menu, Amanda actually laughed. At a planning meeting at her parents' house, she recounted my suggestions to her friends who joined in her amusement at my practical ideas. I was seated at a table with distant relatives, while the main family sat together across the room. Even more telling was Amanda's comment when discussing the wedding videographer. "We need to consider what is best for appearances," she said within my hearing. "Some people just do not photograph well, and we want everything to be perfect." The implication was clear. My appearance, my background, my very presence was something to be managed carefully, so as not to detract from their perfect day. I began to wonder if I would have any role at all beyond writing checks and staying in the background. Despite everything I continued to try, I offered to host the rehearsal dinner at a nice restaurant in Newport that was within my budget. Amanda and her mother had already selected a yacht club instead, with a price tag that made me wince. When I explained my financial limitations, Diane Prescott suggested I could contribute what I could afford and they would cover the rest, her tone making it clear she found my contribution inadequate. As the wedding date approached, I noticed Jacob calling less frequently. When we did speak, conversations revolved entirely around wedding logistics and additional expenses that kept arising. Gone were our heart-to-heart talks and shared memories. In their place was a transactional relationship that left me feeling hollow. The final straw came when I received an email from Amanda about the cabin. She wanted to know if her parents and some out-of-town guests could use it the weekend before the wedding for a casual gathering. The request was phrased as if she already considered the property partly hers, with no recognition of the imposition or the sentimental value the cabin held for me. I agreed reluctantly, spending a week deep cleaning and preparing the cabin for guests who I suspected would find it lacking. As I drove away, leaving the key under the mat, as Amanda had requested, I could not shake the feeling that I was being slowly erased from my son's life, rendered invisible except when my resources were needed. Little did I know that the worst was yet to come, and that a simple phone call would soon force me to make one of the most difficult decisions of my life. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early June, just 3 weeks before the wedding. I was grading final exams from my last semester before retirement when my phone rang. Seeing Jacob's name on the screen brought an immediate smile to my face. Our conversations had become so rare that each one felt precious. "Mom," he began, his voice oddly formal. "I need to talk to you about the wedding arrangements." Something in his tone made me set down my pen and brace myself. He continued with what sounded like a rehearsed speech about difficult decisions and logistical challenges. I remained silent, listening as he circled around whatever he was struggling to say. Finally, after an uncomfortable pause, he spoke the words that would change everything between us. "Amanda and I think it would be best if you did not attend the ceremony," he said, rushing to continue before I could respond. "The venue has strict capacity limits, and with Amanda's extended family and some last-minute additions from her father's business associates, we are in a difficult position." I could not speak. My throat closed around words that refused to form. In the silence, Jacob kept talking, his voice increasingly desperate. "You can still watch via live stream," he offered, as if this were a reasonable compromise. "We will make sure you have the private link. And of course you are still welcome at the day after brunch." When I finally found my voice, it emerged as a whisper. "You do not want me at your wedding." "It is not that we do not want you there," he backpedaled quickly. "It is just a space issue, and Amanda's parents are paying for most of it, so they needed to prioritize their guests. You understand, right?" I did not understand. Not at all. But I also could not bear to beg for an invitation to my only child's wedding. So instead, I told him I needed time to process this information and would call him back. I hung up before he could hear the sob that tore from my chest. That night, I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, images of Jacob as a child flashed through my mind. Teaching him to ride a bike, bandaging skinned knees, staying up all night when he had the flu. The science fair projects I had helped with, the college applications I had proofread, the years of packing his lunch with little notes tucked inside. Had it all meant nothing? In the morning, red-eyed and exhausted, I made coffee and opened my laptop. A notification from Amanda's social media page appeared, showing photos from a wedding planning session. With shaking hands, I scrolled through the images, noticing familiar faces in the background. Amanda's distant cousins from California, her college roommate, even her parents' former neighbors, all apparently more important than the woman who had given birth to the groom. I tried calling Jacob back, but my calls went straight to voicemail. Instead, I received a text message. "Amanda is upset you are making this difficult. We thought you would understand our position." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter I never intended to send. I poured out decades of sacrifice and love, the lonely nights and financial struggles of raising a child alone. I wrote about the magical moments at the cabin that had sustained us through grief and hardship. I asked how he could allow me to be erased from the most important day of his life. When the letter was finished, I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in my desk drawer. My neighbor Carol noticed something was wrong when I did not water my garden for 3 days straight. She brought over a casserole and sat with me at the kitchen table, listening as I finally shared the painful truth. Her outrage on my behalf was both comforting and validating. I was not overreacting. This was not normal. Through our small-town grapevine, I learned something that cut even deeper. A mutual friend whose daughter worked at Amanda's hair salon reported overhearing Amanda complain about wedding guest lists. Apparently, I was being excluded because I was too embarrassing for their upscale event. My clothes were not designer, my accent too distinctly Maine, my profession too ordinary. I was, in Amanda's words, not the right image for their wedding photos. Jacob came to see me briefly the following weekend. He seemed uncomfortable checking his phone constantly and avoiding direct eye contact. He brought a small gift, a bracelet that was clearly selected by Amanda, nothing like anything I would actually wear. He spoke brightly about wedding details as if nothing were wrong, never once addressing the elephant in the room. As he prepared to leave, I overheard him on the phone in the driveway, his voice carrying through my open kitchen window. "Yes, everything is fine," he was saying. "Mom will not be a problem. She understands the situation." I stood frozen by the sink, a dish towel clutched in my hands. Was that all I was to him now? A potential problem to be managed. The son I had raised would never have spoken those words. The transformation was complete. And in that moment, I truly felt I had lost him. Then came the email that pushed me past my breaking point. Amanda had sent a detailed itinerary for her family's use of the cabin for the pre-wedding weekend. The message included a list of suggested upgrades they would appreciate before their arrival, including new bedding, updated kitchen appliances, and possibly repainting the living room in a more neutral color. The email concluded with, "Once Jacob and I are married, we really should discuss renovating the entire property. I have some wonderful ideas that would maximize its potential." In that moment, something inside me shifted. The grief and hurt crystallized into a clarity I had not felt in months. This was no longer just about a wedding invitation. This was about standing up for myself and protecting what was mine, including the truth about the cabin that had been our family sanctuary for over 4 decades. It was time to set the record straight, even if it meant disrupting the perfect Newport wedding that had no place for a simple English teacher from Maine. The day after receiving Amanda's presumptuous email, I drove to the cabin alone. The 3-hour journey gave me time to process the emotions that had been overwhelming me for weeks. By the time I pulled into the gravel driveway, I had moved beyond hurt to something approaching resolve. The cabin welcomed me like an old friend, creaking floors and all. I walked through each room, running my hands over the kitchen table Robert had refinished, straightening the quilts my mother had made, adjusting the photographs that told our family story. This place held our history in every corner, every imperfection. The thought of Amanda's family invading this space, criticizing and planning changes while excluding me from my own son's wedding, was suddenly intolerable. In the small office area off the main room, I knelt and pulled back the braided rug that had covered the floor for decades. Beneath it was a small trapdoor nearly invisible against the wooden planks, unless you knew exactly where to look. Robert had built this hidden compartment to store valuables safely during our absences. The trapdoor opened with a familiar groan. Inside was an old metal lockbox, dusty but intact. I had not looked at these documents in years, had never felt the need to remind myself of what I already knew. But now, with trembling fingers, I lifted out the box and carried it to the kitchen table. Inside were the original purchase documents from 1978. The deed clearly listed Enid Margaret Johnson as the sole owner of the property. There was a letter from my attorney at the time explaining the legal strategy of keeping the cabin in my name, only due to the uncertain financial situation at Robert's company. His name appeared only on peripheral paperwork, creating the impression of co-ownership without any actual legal claim. I found myself transported back to that difficult time. Robert had lost his job during company-wide layoffs, and there were outstanding business loans he had personally guaranteed. We were afraid of losing everything if his former company's financial problems escalated. My inheritance from grandmother Eloise had come at exactly the right moment, allowing us to purchase the cabin outright, but we had decided to protect it by keeping it solely in my name. After Robert's death, I had updated my will with the help of our family lawyer, Malcolm Green. Malcolm had advised me to maintain the cabin's status in my name alone, especially as a widow with a young child to support. I had always intended to transfer ownership to Jacob eventually, but the right time never seemed to arrive. And as the years passed, it simply remained my property, a fact that had seemed unimportant until now. Among the papers was an updated legal letter from 5 years ago, when I had consulted Malcolm about potential property tax implications. The letter reaffirmed my sole ownership and recommended steps for eventual transfer to Jacob when I was ready. I had planned to discuss this with Jacob on his 35th birthday, still 3 years away, when I hoped he would be settled with a family who appreciated the cabin's true value. As I sat surrounded by these documents, my laptop chimed with a new email notification. It was from Amanda to Jacob, accidentally copied to my old email address that Jacob sometimes still used. The message contained a link to her Pinterest board titled Lakefront Renovation, along with the comment, "Just a few ideas for when we update the old place. Daddy says with the right contractor we could double its value in a year." Curiosity and dread propelling me, I clicked the link. The page loaded to reveal dozens of images of modern lakefront homes, all featuring sleek contemporary designs that bore no resemblance to our rustic cabin. There were plans for glass walls, floating staircases, and minimalist furnishings. One pinned image was actually of our cabin photographed during their last visit with a comment, "Before disaster. Cannot wait to gut this place." My hands shook as I closed the laptop. On a hunch, I checked Jacob's tablet that he kept at the cabin for weekend visits. He had apparently forgotten to log out of his email. I would never normally invade his privacy, but these were not normal circumstances. There in his inbox was an entire conversation with Amanda, discussing after we get the cabin renovation plans. They included estimates from contractors and discussions about potentially subdividing the lakefront property for maximum profit. The final piece fell into place when I saw a text message preview on the tablet from Amanda to her mother. "Once we are married, the old cabin is as good as ours. Jacob says his mom never formalized the ownership after his dad died, so it should transfer easily. We can sell it for enough to buy the Beacon Hill place outright." I sat back, a strange calm replacing my earlier distress. They had been planning this all along. The exclusion from the wedding wasn't just about appearances or space limitations. It was the beginning of a systematic erasure, pushing me far enough away that I would have minimal involvement or claim when they made their move on the cabin. That evening I called Malcolm Green, now retired, but still a close friend. After explaining the situation, I asked him to confirm what I already knew about my legal rights. "Enid, you are the sole owner of that property, no question," he assured me. "Your name is on every binding document." Robert's name was only added to certain paperwork for appearance's sake, during a time when women often face discrimination in property matters. "You have always been the legal owner, and no one, not even Jacob, can make any decisions about that property without your consent." Over the next 2 days, I had Malcolm help me update all legal documents related to the cabin. I removed Jacob as the automatic inheritor, instead placing the property in a trust with specific conditions for its future use and ownership. The cabin could never be sold or substantially altered from its current character without unanimous approval from a board of trustees, which included myself, my sister Laura, and Malcolm's son, who had taken over his practice. With the legal protection in place, I made my decision. I would attend the rehearsal dinner uninvited. Not to make a scene or ruin their plans, but to stand up for myself and clarify the truth before they proceeded with assumptions that would lead to further pain. I drove to Newport the day before the rehearsal dinner, checking into a modest hotel on the outskirts of town. I spent the morning having my hair styled professionally for the first time in years. I purchased a simple but elegant navy blue dress that flattered my figure without trying to compete with the designer outfits I knew would dominate the event. That evening in my hotel room, I practiced what I would say. I stood before the mirror, shoulders back, voice steady, rehearsing how to reveal the truth without crumbling into emotion. This wasn't about revenge. It was about honesty and self-respect. 2 values I had tried to instill in Jacob throughout his life. I placed all the documentation in a simple leather portfolio. My hands were steady now, my resolve firm. Tomorrow evening, I would walk into that yacht club with my head held high, not as an uninvited embarrassment to be hidden away, but as a woman reclaiming her place and her voice. As I drove toward Newport Harbor the following evening, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold, I felt a surprising sense of peace. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the same strength that had carried me through widowhood, single parenthood, and decades of building a life on my own terms. Some truths needed to be spoken, even when they disrupted carefully constructed illusions. And the truth about the cabin was just the beginning. The Newport Yacht Club gleamed white against the darkening sky, its windows spilling golden light across the harbor waters. Valets in crisp uniforms assisted guests from luxury vehicles, while soft music drifted from the open doors. I parked my modest sedan myself in the public lot nearby and walked the short distance to the entrance, the leather portfolio tucked securely under my arm. The young man at the door asked for my name, scanning his tablet with a practiced smile. When I said Enid Johnson, mother of the groom, his smile faltered slightly as he scrolled through the guest list again. "I am sorry, but I do not see your name here," he said apologetically. "There must be a mistake," I replied calmly. "Jacob Martin is my son." Before he could respond further, I glimpsed Jacob through the doorway, standing near the bar in animated conversation with Amanda's father. Without waiting for permission, I simply walked past the flustered attendant, entering the elegant space with more confidence than I truly felt. The room was exactly as I had imagined. It would be all crystal chandeliers and floral arrangements, with Newport's elite mingling over cocktails. Conversations paused briefly, as heads turned toward me, then resumed with increased intensity. I recognized no one except for Jacob and Amanda's immediate family, making me acutely aware of how thoroughly I had been excluded from the wedding preparations. Amanda was the first to notice me. She stood near the center of the room in a shimmering cocktail dress, champagne flute in hand, holding court among her bridesmaids. Her expression shifted from confusion to alarm as our eyes met across the crowded space. She quickly set down her glass and moved toward Jacob, gripping his arm and whispering urgently in his ear. Jacob turned, his face paling as he spotted me. For a moment, he looked like my little boy again, caught in some minor mischief, uncertain and afraid. Then Amanda's parents descended on me before he could approach. "Mrs. Johnson," Diane Prescott said with brittle politeness, "there seems to have been some confusion about the events this weekend." "Actually, there is no confusion," I responded evenly. "I am here to speak with my son." Richard Prescott signaled discreetly to a staff member who approached with a concerned expression. I realized they were preparing to have me removed like an unwanted intruder rather than the mother of the groom. Before they could act, I walked directly toward Jacob and Amanda, who now stood frozen near the main table. Guests parted before me, conversations dying as the tension became palpable. I felt dozens of curious eyes following my progress across the room. Jacob looked torn between embarrassment and guilt, shifting his weight from foot to foot as I approached. Amanda's expression had hardened into something closer to anger, her perfect features arranged in a mask of displeasure. "You were not invited for a reason," she hissed, as I reached them low enough that only Jacob and I could hear. "This is inappropriate and embarrassing." I met her gaze steadily. "What is inappropriate? Amanda is excluding the mother of the groom from his wedding." Jacob finally found his voice. "Mom, please, this is not the time or place." "When would be the right time, Jacob?" I asked quietly. "After the wedding. After you and Amanda make plans for property that does not belong to you." His eyes widened slightly, confusion replacing discomfort. I turned to address the room, raising my voice just enough to be heard. "I would like to make a toast to the couple," I announced, reaching for an untouched champagne flute from a nearby tray. The room fell completely silent as a server, unsure what to do, filled my glass. No one moved to stop me. The social conventions were too strong, the potential scene too awkward. Amanda's fingers tightened around her own glass until her knuckles whitened. "I have watched my son Jacob grow from a curious little boy into the man who stands before you today." I began, my voice growing stronger with each word. "When he was 7 years old, his father died suddenly. leaving us to navigate life together. The cabin on Lake Winnipesaukee became our sanctuary, the place where we healed and grew together through difficult times. I noticed Jacob's expression softening at the memories, his eyes meeting mine with something like recognition of the shared history that Amanda could never truly understand. In that cabin, I taught Jacob to fish off the dock, just as his father had begun to teach him. We spent winters by the fireplace, reading books, and summers, swimming in the cool lake waters. It was there that he learned about resilience, about finding joy, even after loss, about the difference between price and value. I turned slightly to face Jacob more directly. "Do you remember the promise we made, Jacob? That the cabin would remain in our family for generations, a testament to the love that built it." He nodded almost imperceptibly, color rising in his cheeks. "That cabin has been the heart of our family for 45 years, I continued. "What you may not know, what I never had reason to tell you until now, is that I have always been the sole legal owner of that property." I opened the portfolio and removed the original deed, holding it where Jacob could see his grandmother's name clearly listed as the source of funds and my name as the only owner. "In 1978, when your father was facing potential financial difficulties at work, my inheritance from grandmother Eloise purchased the cabin outright. For legal protection, it was put solely in my name, though your father's name appeared on some documents for appearance's sake. After his death, I maintained sole ownership, always intending to share the truth with you when the time was right." Amanda's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor, with a crash that echoed through the silent room. She did not even notice her eyes fixed on the documents in my hand, with an expression of disbelief and growing fury. "That cannot be true," she said, her voice rising. "Jacob told me the cabin would be his inheritance." I simply handed the papers to Jacob, who took them with trembling hands. He scanned the documents, recognition dawning in his eyes. "It is true," I said gently. "I have always been the legal owner. And I recently discovered that there are plans to sell or dramatically alter the property once you two are married." Jacob's head snapped up, confusion evident. "What are you talking about?" But Amanda's reaction told the real story. Her face flushed deep red, then drained of all color. She grabbed for the papers in Jacob's hands. "This is ridiculous. You cannot just show up uninvited and start making accusations." I reached into the portfolio again and removed printouts of her Pinterest board and the email exchanges I had discovered. "These are your own words, Amanda. Your plans to, as you put it, gut the place once it was yours to control." Jacob took the printouts, scanning them with growing dismay. I saw the exact moment when the truth hit him, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to a deep, profound hurt. "Mandy, is this true?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Were you planning to sell the cabin?" Amanda's composure finally shattered completely. She snatched the papers from his hands, tearing them in a gesture of defiance. "Of course it was the plan," she shouted, abandoning all pretense. "That decrepit old shack is sitting on $2 million worth of lakefront property. Your mother has been selfish, keeping it all to herself when it could set us up in the lifestyle we deserve." The room had gone completely, still guests frozen in place, witnessing the implosion of what had appeared to be a perfect couple. "You never liked the cabin," Jacob said slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle. "You never cared about what it meant to me." "What it meant to you?" Amanda scoffed. "A bunch of childish memories. We are adults, Jacob. Adults make financial decisions based on reality, not sentiment." I stood quietly, allowing the truth to unfold between them. This was their moment of reckoning, and I had no desire to interrupt it. "Is that why you did not want my mother at our wedding?" Jacob asked, his voice gaining strength. "Because you knew she might interfere with your plans for the cabin?" Amanda's laugh was brittle. "Please. I did not want her there because she does not fit with the image we are trying to project. Look at her. She would have stood out like a sore thumb among my family and friends." The cruelty of her words hung in the air. Jacob looked at me, really looked at me perhaps for the first time in months. I saw shame in his eyes, but also a dawning recognition. "That is my mother you are talking about," he said quietly but with unmistakable anger. "The woman who raised me alone after my father died. The woman who worked 2 jobs so I could go to college without crushing debt. The woman who taught me everything I know about what really matters in life. He turned to face me fully, and in that moment I saw my son again, the person I had raised rather than the stranger he had become under Amanda's influence. "Mom, I am so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I do not know how I let things get to this point." Amanda grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "You cannot be serious," she hissed. "Everything is arranged. My parents have spent a fortune on this wedding." Jacob gently but firmly removed her hand. "You were going to exclude my mother from our wedding so you could steal her property," he said, the words falling like stones between them. What kind of beginning would that have been for our marriage? The Prescotts had finally recovered enough to intervene. Richard stepped forward, his businessman's instincts taking over. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately," he suggested, gesturing toward a side door. But it was too late for damage control. The truth had been spoken aloud, witnessed by dozens of their closest friends and family. Amanda's true nature had been revealed, not by my accusations, but by her own words and actions. "I think I have said what I came to say," I told Jacob quietly. "The decisions you make now are yours alone." As I turned to leave, head held high, Amanda's voice rose once more, vibrating with rage. "You have ruined everything," she screamed. "Everything." I paused at the door, looking back at my son standing amid the wreckage of his rehearsal dinner, and spoke one last truth. "No, Amanda. You did that all by yourself." The Newport Harbor lights twinkled in the darkness as I walked back to my car, emotionally exhausted, but somehow lighter than I had felt in months. I had spoken my truth without malice or vengeance, simply stating facts that needed to be acknowledged. What happened next was out of my hands. I did not have to wait long to find out. As I was checking out of my hotel the following morning, my phone rang. It was Jacob, his voice rough as if he had been up all night. "The wedding is postponed," he said without preamble, "indefinitely." I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed, unsure how to respond. Was he calling to blame me, to share his relief? The silence stretched between us until he spoke again. "Can I see you before you drive back to Maine?" We met at a small coffee shop near the harbor, away from the wedding venues and the drama of the previous night. Jacob looked disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed, but there was something different about him too, a clarity that had been missing for too long. "I am so sorry, Mom," he said as soon as we were seated. The words he had repeated throughout our lives whenever he made a mistake, from broken windows to curfew violations. But never had they carried such weight. "You do not need to apologize," I began, but he shook his head firmly. "Yes, I do. I let Amanda push you out of my life. I stood by while she insulted you and plotted to take your property. I became someone I do not recognize, someone my dad would have been ashamed of." The mention of Robert rare from Jacob these days brought tears to my eyes. I reached across the table and took his hand. "Your father would never be ashamed of you," I said firmly. "Disappointed, maybe, but he would also understand how easy it is to lose your way when you love someone." Jacob laughed bitterly. "I do not think what I felt for Amanda was love. Not really. It was more like being hypnotized by the lifestyle, the connections, the status. After you left last night, we had it out completely. She admitted so many things, Mom. She never intended for us to have a real relationship with you after the wedding. The cabin was just the beginning." He told me how Amanda had been systematically pushing him into debt, insisting on appearances they could not afford. The designer clothes, the exclusive memberships, even the extravagant honeymoon had all been financed through loans he would be paying off for years. "I chose all of that over you," he said, his voice breaking. "Over the person who has always been there for me no matter what. How could I have been so blind?" I squeezed his hand, remembering the many mistakes I had made in my own life, the times I had valued the wrong things or trusted unwisely. "We all get lost sometimes, Jacob. The important thing is finding your way back." We talked for hours that morning, more honestly than we had in years. About the cabin and what it truly represented. About Robert and the legacy he had left beyond material possessions. About the values that had shaped our family, and how easily they could be eroded by external pressures. When we finally parted, Jacob promised to come to the cabin the following weekend. I left with cautious hope but no expectations. He had a lot to work through, including the financial and social fallout of a canceled society wedding. True to his word, Jacob arrived at the cabin the following Friday evening. As I watched him walk down to the dock and stand looking out over the water, I was struck by how much he resembled his father in that moment. The same thoughtful stance, the same connection to this place. I joined him silently, and we stood side by side watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of orange and pink. Without warning, Jacob turned and pulled me into a tight hug, something he had not done with such openness since he was a teenager. Later that evening, while searching for a deck of cards in the living room cabinet, he found his old fishing rod, the one Robert had helped him select on his 8th birthday. He held it reverently, running his fingers along the worn handle, and then to my surprise broke down in tears. "I have been so lost, Mom," he sobbed as I held him. "So completely lost." That weekend began our healing process. Jacob helped me with cabin maintenance tasks that had been neglected, and I taught him how to make his father's favorite fish stew. We talked about Robert, about my teaching career, about Jacob's true aspirations beyond the path Amanda had charted for him. By Sunday evening, something fundamental had shifted between us. The distance that had grown over the past 2 years had not disappeared completely, but a bridge was forming across the gap. The following week, I met with Malcolm Green and made a decision I had been contemplating for years. I transferred 49% ownership of the cabin to Jacob with a legal protection clause that prevented sale or major alteration without mutual consent. The cabin would continue to be our shared sanctuary with its character and history preserved. Over the next 3 months, I watched my son gradually return to the person I had raised. He moved from his expensive Boston apartment to a smaller place in Cambridge, sold the luxury car. Amanda had insisted he finance and began working with a financial advisor to address the debt he had accumulated. More importantly, I saw him reconnect with his authentic self. He started fishing again, invited old college friends to the cabin for a weekend, and even mentioned taking some courses in environmental conservation, an interest he had abandoned when it did not align with Amanda's vision of success. Amanda made one attempt to claim partial rights to the cabin, sending a lawyer's letter demanding compensation for wedding expenses and emotional distress. Malcolm's response, a simple 3-page document outlining my clear ownership and the absence of any legal claim on her part, ended that effort immediately. By Thanksgiving, Jacob seemed ready to truly move forward. He invited a small group of close friends to join us at the cabin, people who appreciated its rustic charm rather than seeing it as an investment opportunity. As we gathered around the table Robert had built all those years ago, I felt his presence more strongly than I had in years. During these months of reconnection and healing, I found myself reflecting deeply on the lessons of this painful chapter. For decades, I had defined myself primarily as Jacob's mother, putting his needs and happiness above my own. In trying to support his relationship with Amanda, I had allowed myself to be diminished and marginalized, accepting treatment I would never have tolerated in any other context. Standing up for myself had not been about asserting ownership of a property, but about reclaiming my dignity and worth. It had been about honoring the life Robert and I had built, and the values we had tried to pass on to our son. I also came to understand that true love, whether between parent and child or between partners, never requires erasure of the self. Jacob and I were building a new relationship now, one based on mutual respect rather than dependency or obligation. I would always be his mother, but I was also Enid Johnson, a woman with her own identity and boundaries. On a crisp December morning, Jacob and I sat on the dock with fishing lines in the water, just as we had done hundreds of times before. The lake was still reflecting the surrounding pines and the pale winter sky. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Mom," he said quietly. "And thank you for standing up for yourself that night. I needed to see that." I smiled, casting my line out again. It took me 68 years to learn that lesson myself. Standing up for yourself is not selfish. Sometimes it is the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for the people who need to see your truth. The cabin would remain our sanctuary, a place of honesty and healing for generations to come, just as Robert and I had dreamed all those years ago. And I had reclaimed not just my property, but something far more valuable, my voice and my place in my son's life. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against family pressure? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest boundaries to set are with the people we love most. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more real-life experiences about family relationships and finding your voice. Thank you for listening. And remember, it is never too late to speak your truth and reclaim your power.